All righty. I am going to get started because we have a lot of ground to cover in a very short period of time. I would like to say good afternoon to everybody. I'm Allison Lafferlita. I'm the Executive Director for the Nonprofit Resource Hub, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Creative Approaches to HR in 2023. This webinar is presented by Jill Krumholz, co-owner and managing partner of RealHR Solutions, and her colleague, HR consultant Conor Hughes. In today's webinar, Jill and Conor will delve into the latest and most impactful HR strategies, innovative programs, and best practices, including branding, retention, employee development, compensation analysis, and benchmarking, creative benefit solutions, and technology to help you attract, retain, and develop talent. Your takeaways for today: you'll have gained knowledge and insight and a creative ability to identify practical approaches to people management strategies. So before we get started, for those of you that are new with us, and I see that there are quite a few that are new with us, I wanted to give you a quick background on the Nonprofit Resource Hub, what we do, and what we do to support the nonprofit community. We are a professional association providing education, support services, and goods to the nonprofit community. We provide a variety of free educational opportunities like this webinar today, as well as another one called Ask the Expert, which is a lunchtime series where you can talk directly to the expert in that field and ask any questions you like. We offer virtual workshops and our annual board development conference that's held on National Philanthropy Day in November. We also provide different opportunities to provide exclusive support to executive directors through our monthly virtual ED resource exchange and support meetings. These meetings are a safe space for our executive directors to connect with one another, exchange resources, exchange war stories, and create their own support networks. We also offer our nonprofit partners the opportunity to come together in person to meet with one another and our associate members at our quarterly meet and greets. These events are great opportunities for our nonprofit partners to meet with their counterparts in the industry, learn helpful resources, meet vetted professionals we work with to ask questions and build their networks. We do have some events coming up, and I would like to mention them to you briefly. May 16th is our Executive Director Resource Exchange and Support Session, which I just mentioned to you. May 17th is Virtual Office Hours with Peter Heller from Heller Fundraising Group. May 24th is our next meet and greet in New York City at the American Red Cross office. If you'd like to register for any of these events, all you need to do is go onto our website, nonprofitresourcehub.org, and you'll be able to register for these events. All of them are free of charge. And if you'd like to join as a nonprofit partner with the Hub, it is also free of charge to our nonprofit community. To join, you just need to go right on over to the website as well. And naturally, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to call me or email me. We'll set up some time to talk, and I'll be happy to walk you through what we do in more detail. So without further ado, and in consideration of the time, I would like to introduce today's presenters, Jill Krumholz and Conor Hughes. Jill, Conor, welcome.
Welcome, and thank you so much, Allison. We have been members of Nonprofit Resource Hub for over 2 years, and it is a great organization. And for those of you who are members, that's wonderful, and thank you for attending. And for those of you who are not, we would welcome speaking with you about the Hub further. So Allison, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And Kelly and Christina, thank you as well. So I am one of the owners of RealHR Solutions. We are, and my colleague here is Conor Hughes, and I would love for Conor to talk a little bit about himself and his approach to HR. We'll share with you that RealHR Solutions has been in business for 17 years. We support both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, really more nonprofits. We have national reach, and our solutions are really focused on a few things: providing strategic and advisory support to organizations relative to their people management, HR outsourcing, where we provide ongoing support as needed, and then many projects, which include executive search, work on rewards, employee investigations, HR audits, HR assessments, and job descriptions. So we really are a full cycle HR function for our clients. And so we are very pleased to be here today, and we really have a very robust agenda here. But I would like to introduce Conor, and I think that as we were preparing for this, we were really talking about kind of the different views we have based on generation, based on our approach, and I'm really thrilled to have him join me today. Conor?
Thank you, Jill. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all today. It's my first time participating in one of these webinars for Nonprofit Resource Hub, so thank you for having me. My name is Conor Hughes. I'm a consultant here with RealHR Solutions, and I have been in HR for quite a few years. Prior to joining RealHR, I was the head of HR for a nonprofit in Westchester County, New York, of about 300 employees. Since then, I've moved out to Denver, Colorado. So everyone is saying good afternoon. For me, it's good morning still. And it's really nice to be able to partner with Jill on this presentation because we do have very differing perspectives here. I have a background in marketing. I used to have my own marketing communications firm. And the reason I bring this up is because oftentimes HR is kind of considered the internal version of communications, right? The internal marketing for our employees. And so I kind of take that approach to a lot of how I kind of deliver HR services and how I'm an HR practitioner. I'm also a board member for the Westchester Human Resource Management Association. And I have a pretty strong background in tech. I've really been an advocate for technology and the use of technology to streamline processes. And you'll hear a bit more about that during this presentation. So yeah, it's great to be here today, and I'm glad to partner with everybody.
Good.
Great. So I think we'll jump right into our agenda today and kind of talk a little bit about what we'll be reviewing today. And this list that we have presented here is by no means in any order of priority. This is really just the environment in which HR kind of operates. And so we'll be talking today about talent acquisition, culture and employee engagement, performance management, learning and employee development, compensation and benefits, and then finalizing with HR technology. And Jill, I think you had a really interesting perspective about this as we were talking earlier today about how these are really, it's this organic environment where one feeds into another and there's different feedback mechanisms between all of these, right?
Right. Yes. And in fact, I was visualizing this in really kind of a circular way. Because while we're talking about this and saying talent and talent acquisition and retention and culture and performance and all of these things that one feeds into another, each of you are probably approaching this from a different perspective, depending upon what your needs are. And so what I would love to jump into is really finding out a little bit about you. So Conor's kind of going to lead this section.
So when we talk about the HR function, we have to realize what sort of resources you have at your organization. And so in a lot of our work, we see three different sort of sections of where HR professionals find their support and where organizations find their support. So oftentimes you'll find that you will have a dedicated internal HR professional. Most times for smaller nonprofits, the resources are a little limited, so we might not necessarily have a dedicated HR professional. So in that case, we may find that you're engaging with a PEO, professional employer organization, or you may have some outsourced HR by engaging with an HR consulting firm. So I think what would be really great at this point is if everybody could kind of pop into the chat and just let us know what your resources are. What are you working with right now? And I think that will help guide the conversation so we can really highlight the important factors that will be coming up for you. So feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat. Let us know where you're at. And then as you're doing that, it would be great to find out if you guys have fewer than 50 employees or more than 50 employees as well, just to kind of give us a gauge of what you're working with. So we see internal HR department for some folks. We see outsourced HR functions, around 21 employees. We have a full-time HR person. This is great. Thank you, Meghna. Internal HR. Okay, first-time HR manager. All right, welcome. We're glad to see you here. This is some fantastic professional development opportunity. Good for you. 15 employees, HR is the function of the ED and the finance and operations manager. I think we see that often, right? We see that quite a bit, Joe, seeing that the executive director will take on a lot of the HR responsibilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Feel free to keep popping them in there. We'll keep an eye on the chat.
I'll ask you also if you would share with us whether your organization is fewer than 50 or more than 50 employees. Obviously, we see some parallels between kind of your resources, your HR resources internally. Would love to kind of know how large the organizations are.
Yeah, seeing a pretty decent split here between fewer and more than 50. Yeah. Abby Duran got 25 employees. Thank you, Abby. Genesis, more than 50. All right, great. So I think with that, Joe, maybe we'll jump into the first section that we're going to talk about, unless there's anything else we wanted to touch on here. Yeah, great. So Jill, I think you'll lead this one off for us.
Sure. So talent acquisition, I think if we look back in the last few years, the focus has been tremendously around acquiring and retaining talent, but certainly around the tremendous churn of talent that organizations were having. And I'm going to step back for a second to say that we recognize that with nonprofits, we're talking about greater demands that your organizations have, and that your resources are obviously, and your funding is not growing as your demand is growing. So it puts enormous strain on your organization. And I think one of the things that RealHR Solutions does, and I think it's very important to us as we're working with organizations and speaking with organizations like yourselves, is really to look at the fact that we're not suggesting or encouraging you to spend money per se. We're really looking at solutions to reallocate possibly where you're spending your money, and to look at ways of being more creative. So as Conor and I were preparing today and looking at all of these areas and functions of your people management, really thinking about, and we would ask you to do the same, is to think about how we do these things in a low cost way, right? So around talent acquisition, we're really talking a great deal about how do you spend money wisely. We were talking to an organization the other day, and they've been using the same job posting site for a very long time, and they're really not getting what they need. So what are creative ways of looking for your talent? How are you looking at this from a perspective of really broad diversity in a way that is beyond color and age and so forth? It's diversity of thought. And then to Conor's strength, and I love Conor, I love when he speaks about this, strengthening the employer brand is such an important piece. And for those of you who've heard me speak before, I think that nonprofit orgs spend a lot of time and focus, and understandably, on branding themselves and marketing themselves as it relates to donors. We don't often think about or think enough about branding ourselves as it relates to attracting talent. So Conor, would love for you to speak to that a little bit, and would love for folks to kind of ask questions as we go along. We would really prefer that you ask questions rather than hold them to the end, although there will be questions and answers at the end.
Thanks, Jill. So this is one of the areas where I really geek out. I love talking about recruitment and the employer brand, and that's probably because of my background in marketing, right? And so I think one of the things that nonprofits like Jill, you had just mentioned, that they focus so much on is their marketing strategy and their brand development for their organization to increase their fundraising, right? To really have a lot of focus there. But nonprofits are so strapped when it comes to resources that sometimes when it comes to talent acquisition, it's really difficult to get some of the top talent because nonprofits have budgetary restrictions that we just can't get away from. So we have to figure out a strategy to attract this top talent and make it worth their while to join our organization. And so when we talk about strengthening the employer brand, we want to consider things like, how are we putting out what the culture is at this organization? What are the benefits? What does the total compensation package look like? And we want to make sure that this is transparent and communicated in a way to the candidates where they are engaged from the very beginning, and we maintain that sense of urgency and that level of interest that the candidate might have in the organization. And so throughout this presentation, you'll see a couple of times where we reference, really highlighting these factors at at your organization, at your businesses. But it's important to make sure that storytelling is out there from the very beginning. And so HR and marketing, if you have two different departments at your organization, you can find some really nice synergies between these two departments and these functions to support one another in this endeavor of attracting top talent. And it's something that it's pretty easy win, right? It's a pretty quick win. You don't have to put a lot of money towards this, but you can consider things like, what is the sort of media that you're sharing with people? Are you sharing employee testimonials? Are you highlighting some of the auxiliary benefits that your organization has right from the beginning in the job posting? And so there are different approaches that you can look at when it comes to talent acquisition to make sure that you're attracting the right talent, and then getting creative in that recruitment process, and then spending wisely, kind of like how Jill was mentioning, that we know you're spending the money on recruitment. You have these resources that are dedicated. Now is a point to really review what your return on investment is like for those. Are you taking the right approach to reach the right sort of candidate that you're looking for? So if you were to think of recruiting in like the sales process, right? Like during the sales process, you want to identify, or even the donor process, you want to identify what that candidate profile looks like for your donors or for your target audience. If you have a product that you're selling, you want to do the same thing when it comes to recruitment, right? Like, what does the ideal employee look like? How does that person fit into this culture? What do they bring to us? And then once that's figured out, figure out a way to target that person individually, right? So are you going to LinkedIn? Are you going to Indeed? Is that where these candidates are? Or is there maybe an opportunity to utilize your own social media to connect with those folks? And I think particularly what's interesting for nonprofit organizations is that a lot of the missions behind these organizations are so altruistic and has such great, like, important work behind them that you want to find where those people are engaging regularly, right? And so you might not necessarily find a candidate on a job board, but you might find them in a forum or a chat somewhere online where they're talking about that mission and the work that's being done around the globe or around the country, in related to the mission that you guys are working on. So it's an opportunity to diversify your approach. And yeah, it's a big, it's expansive and quite comprehensive, but it's a lot of fun once you get into it. Yeah, Jill, do you have anything else for talent acquisition?
No, but well, we could talk about any one of these topics at great length, and we're both very passionate about these areas. One of the things that I would really encourage is for people to share not just questions, but also experience that they're having, that we should bring to light here, because again, we would like this, even though there are a lot of people on it, and we appreciate that people have tuned in and are spending their time here. I would also ask you to kind of raise your hand in the chat, and we would love to hear and respond to and comment around the things that you're sharing with us. So if we move on, Conor, in terms of the next slide.
Yeah.
So culture. So, we keep hearing about, and I know that organizations and leaders understand that this is a very employee-centric world we live in. And so when we look at culture and employee engagement, it really is so important as HR folks, as leaders of organizations, that we really look at our culture. And the culture piece, as I visualize this, is really kind of the middle of that kind of consent, that circle of how are you impacting each of the areas of people management. And that culture piece and the employee-centric focus of this has never been as tremendous. And, fortunately or unfortunately, it is here to stay. And I think that when we talk about even hybrid situations, or the programs that we're looking at, and how do we address generational differences, it really is around looking at what your culture is and identifying your culture and really speaking to that culture. And that culture, as Conor said earlier, really impacts who you're going to attract to your organization. So Conor, I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah. No, I mean, Jill, that's exactly it, right? Like that culture feeds into every other part of your organization. It is a two-way feedback mechanism to every other function within your HR sort of department, right? And so when we're talking about organizational culture as a priority, of course, clearly we've already identified how this is related to talent acquisition, right? You really want to showcase what your culture looks like for a candidate. But then also when we look at it internally, right? So that's looking at your organizational culture as a priority for talent acquisition is fantastic, and we also have to really make sure that the culture itself is intentional and that it is co-created in the organization. And one way to do that is by assessing the values and the workplace behaviors, attitudes, and the leadership effectiveness, right? So many of our clients have come to us and asked us to conduct an employee engagement survey. And those are great pieces of data that you gather to be able to understand what the organizational culture looks like now and where you want it to grow into. And you're soliciting that feedback from your employees to do that, right? And I think that's one of the things that's most important when we're talking about culture here, is to make sure that we're listening to the employees, to make sure that we're hearing what they want and that we're responding meaningfully. And so that comes down to communication effectiveness, right? So how is communication conducted at your organization? Is this just a checkbox that we're doing for our employees to say, okay, we did a survey and now we kind of get to move on to the next thing? You have to make sure that you're ready to take the actions that come from that data. And by doing so, you're building an inclusive culture, right? You're co-creating what it's like to live in that space and to be a part of that community. And so culture and employee engagement are just paramount to almost everything. And it, kind of aids your retention, and it increases employee buy-in. Like there's no amount of effort and resources that you can go above and beyond with when it comes to culture and employee engagement. You want your employees to be happy. And I think that's part of the reason why I kind of got into HR, right? Like many of us have had jobs in the past where I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot at work before going to work and sobbing because I was just so terrified and just really dreading the day, right? And that's not the kind of culture that I wanted to be a part of. That's not the sort of work environment that I wanted to be a part of. And so for me, getting into HR was to really make sure that we are employee centric. And not only is that a better experience for the employee, but we know that a happy employee is a productive employee. So it's also helping our bottom line at the same time. So yeah, culture and employee engagement, this is something to really focus on in your organizations.
And I think this actually speaks back to the entire concept of acquisition and branding, right? So you are branding your culture to attract the people you want. And then you're living those values, right, that you've communicated to the outside world. And again, I think the onus is on organizations and leaders to affect that kind of change in your organization. And again, I think that we tend to think that HR services are costly. And yes, it's expensive to have an HR professional in your org. It's expensive to have an HR consulting firm potentially working with you. But the cost of not doing things like that is so tremendous. And we're even going to get into that as we talk about HR and technology, right? The cost of not having it is in many ways greater than the cost of not doing it.
So yeah, with that, I think we kind of change the pace a little bit here and pop into performance management. Jill, I know you're an expert in this field, so I will let you take the lead here.
Well, that's setting me up. So while I don't think I'm an expert in it, I think that what I have seen, fortunately or unfortunately, is a lot of change over many years. So that's what I would say. And so thanks for being so kind, Conor. Right. So I think the concept of performance, and again, we would love for you to kind of raise your hand in the chat and share with us so we can share with the rest of the participants. We're in a place in organizations where, and this is dictated a lot by kind of who you're bringing into your organization, what the culture is. Cultures have gotten much looser in a lot of ways. Things are, while they need to be purposeful, they're changing. And so in terms of generations and the formalities and lack of formalities, right? Performance reviews and the performance management process I've seen it swing over the years like a pendulum from one way to another, but performance and performance process has become a lot more flexible, a lot less rigid, it really is driven by ongoing communication and feedback that is not just once a year or not even just twice a year, but ongoing. And certainly we'll talk about kind of the different ways of receiving feedback, of which 360 is part of that. And Conor will speak about utilizing technology and how important that is. But I think that it really is about rethinking at this point. Are your employees, do they understand what the expectations are from you as leaders, from the organization, from their coworkers? And what kind of feedback are you giving them so that they can perform in a more accelerated way and they can grow and develop as well?
Yeah.
So kind of your perspective.
Yeah, so I think it's great that we're kind of talking about the evolution of what performance management looks like, and that we're sharing this feedback and what kind of feedback. And I think something that I've noticed somewhat as a trend here, because as say a millennial, right? I'm on TikTok and I'm on HR TikTok. And so I'm seeing a lot of these new trends from these emerging professionals. And one of the things that I've been noticing here is how we're communicating across an organization, right? This comes back to some of the culture like we were talking about before, but particularly when it comes to performance management, I think it's important for us to understand how we're going about this process, right? And so I think before we go any further, I would love for people to toss into the chat here, how often are your organizations doing performance reviews? Are you doing these annually? Are these biannually, quarterly? Are you doing them once a month? That'll help us understand a little bit about where the audience is right now. So feel free to go ahead and pop that in the chat. We'd love to talk to your points there a little bit. Annual, thank you, Jeff. Biannually, okay. Annually, once a year, okay. Wow. We ask team members to meet quarterly, okay. Annual again. All right, so we see a lot of people sticking with the annual feedback. You know what? Something is better than nothing. And if that works for your organization, I think that's great. But
The eternal optimist.
right. There's definitely a trend though, where we're seeing that it's happening much more frequently than just once a year. And I think that speaks to a couple of things. One is that we're giving the employees an opportunity to course correct quicker along the way, and we're also making sure that we're aligning expectations with behavior, right? So performing these performance reviews or performance management, or however you do this, and even in a less formal capacity, is not only are you giving the instant feedback to the employee, but you're also going to start seeing quicker behavior changes during the year, right? So if we're waiting for the entire year, and of course, I'm sure you're all having conversations with your employees throughout the year, so I'm not saying you're only reviewing this once, but making it a bit more of an intentional process, I think, is important. And so what I was discussing earlier about the communication style and some of the trends that we've seen through certain social media networks is that a lot of emerging professionals are open to this kind of feedback. They're open, and they are actually soliciting a lot of this more regular feedback, but it's how we're doing this and in what format we're presenting this sort of performance feedback is really important to focus on, right? So if anybody wants to toss into the chat like a yes, me, or I know what that means, tell me if this resonates with you, but have you ever gotten an email from your boss saying, need to talk at 2 p.m.? Do you feel this instant surge of anxiety run through your body, or you start asking, what happened? Am I about to get fired? And then 2 o'clock comes along and you realize, oh, it's to tell me I did a good job on this one project, right? And so I think we have to be, cognizant of how we're communicating with our employees, and to make sure that we're setting the stage for what this process will look like, and that we're setting up an environment where the employee feels that they can be vulnerable to ask for help and support where they need it, and they can also receive any kind of feedback or constructive criticism in a way where it doesn't necessarily feel that they're getting in trouble, right? This is all in an effort to improve performance and help the employee grow. So that's just one of the things that I've kind of seen most recently. And of course, technology comes into this. How are we going to utilize that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. Are we meeting with the employee once a month face-to-face? Do you have an employee who's better at communicating with just email and that's more comfortable for them? And I think that that's while you want to be as inclusive as possible in how you're delivering this, you also want it to be pretty standard. But there is something to be said about meeting the employees where they are. And that can, again, come back to an engagement survey you might conduct.
Right. I think that the performance management process it's, and we say this about every area that we're talking about, but it touches on everything else, right? It touches on salary and rewards and culture and so forth. But while I think it's an onerous process to have a performance management process is onerous. Having it once a year in certain ways is more onerous than having it more frequently, because the structure changes, right? The interaction changes. I would think, and I would love for someone who does a lot of ongoing check-ins to kind of say something in the chat about that, because while it may feel overwhelming when we talk about, doing more than an annual, the check-ins and kind of creating that and enculturating that in your organization, while it is a shift initially, brings a lot of great capability within your organization to the communication process, to people knowing where they are, to resetting goals in the midst of things, because things change all the time. So I think that where there can be fluidity and rethinking and reworking, kind of that communication process is important. I'm also hearing more and more, and I heard it years ago, but I'm hearing more about 360s, right? So that information from your peers, information from your subordinates, from different areas of the organization that are utilizing your services, right, is really important. I'm seeing that MI or MJ, I can't see that, is doing a 30-90 an annual. Okay, so you're doing an initial review, performance review when people come in. Yeah, and it is a great way of giving feedback. Thank you for that.
For sure.
Yeah.
I was just going to say there was one thing that really stuck out to me here. So most recently, I think I had written a blog post about performance management for nonprofits specifically. And during some of my research, and just as the blog post and the article was, kind of coming to fruition here, I, remembered this quote from Brene Brown, and I'm sure most of us here are very familiar with her, but she has a talk, as we mostly know, about vulnerability and courage and what all these mean. And so she had this one line where it was, to be clear is to be kind, and to be unclear is unkind, right? And so I think that really applies here, right? Because the more clear that you can be with an employee about setting expectations and then also providing that instant feedback, that's a kindness to them, right? You're allowing them the opportunity to understand what's going on, to be able to fix what's not. And then on the other side of it, if you're not having these regular check-ins and you're not regularly communicating these and you're not being clear enough with the employee, we're not really giving the employees an opportunity to improve, right? You can't expect someone to perform to a certain level that they might not necessarily understand. And so it's really about that transparency and maintaining that communication, because as the more clear we can get with the employees, that's the kinder that we can be towards these individuals. And I think that's something really important to remember in the back of our heads, right? We're dealing with human beings, right? We have to keep that in mind at all times. And Jill, I'd just love to hear kind of like what you think about that.
I haven't heard her say that, but I think that's great. I love that. And it really is true. I mean, for many of us, and I just know personally that when I don't have clarity, right, that causes anxiety. So from a personal and a professional standpoint, it is just, I mean, I embrace that totally. So I think that is terrific. More and more, Abby, thank you. I see a lot of people I know here. Thank you. More and more employees are requesting 360s, right? It forces, although, I hope that we learn not to feel like it's the word force, but it encourages us to have a lot more communication across an organization. And what we have found is, while again, prepping for that, getting the organization into that mindset takes time and is very purposeful, it then becomes part of your culture. So for those who are accustomed, those organizations that are accustomed to doing 360s, it really does become second nature, right? It's making the shift in all of these areas that's really most challenging.
Yeah. And I really love that you just again mentioned there, Joe, the idea that it's also feeding into the culture, right? Like part of the culture is, do you feel that you're in an environment where you feel safe to fail, or you feel comfortable and that you're in an environment where you can give and receive this sort of feedback? But like you had just mentioned before, you know, as Abby was even just saying here, that more and more employees are requesting these 360s. We need to then start addressing to ourselves, does our workforce know how to do this? Are our managers fully prepared and adequately, you know, trained on how to give and receive that feedback? And I think that leads nicely into our next slide here, where we're talking about some of the learning and development. And Jill, I would love to hear what some of your experience has been with this. And yeah.
Yeah. So I was waiting for you to dive into this, but that's okay. So I think that learning and development is changing with time. And I think some of the things that are happening for nonprofits, and I think probably for many of you, is that while you may not have formal training programs, you know, you may not have your employees going out to costly or being online with costly programs. Or you may not, as in days ago, you know, years ago, where you'd have a learning organization come in to do that training, you know, or referring out to a university situation. You know, that we don't have the luxury of that. But how do we create learning and development culture? Again, you know, it keeps going back to culture. How do we create a learning and development culture where we're attracting employees because we invest in them? And again, investing does not necessarily have to be huge financial investing, but how do we invest in them? And how do we, and Conor will speak about this, but how do we, one, identify what the needs are, right? And then how do we sit back as an org and just determine what's our strategy going to be around this? What are we spending money on? What are we not spending money on? What are the kind of what's the low-hanging fruit, right? And what are the things that we can do, whether it's mentorship programs or cross-training, not to step on your toes, Conor, but what are the things that we can do to really build the organization and a learning culture? So I'll turn that over to you, Conor.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. So this is one of those other areas where I really I can kind of talk on at length. So in my most recent engagements prior to joining RealHR, I invested a lot of time in building out an entire learning management system for my organization. So we had 300 plus employees, and we wanted to make sure that we had a system and structure in place to make sure that every employee understood what they needed to do for their job, right? And so it came down to putting together this system where we had the structure and the curriculum and the learning paths in place so that everything would be consistent, so that we knew that anyone who took this training was adequately prepared to complete the job at hand, right? And as I was building this out, what was really nice is that organically through this process, I realized that learning and development, this total strategy, goes so much further than just preparing someone to complete the tasks of a particular job, right? And so when we're identifying employee development needs and creating a learning development strategy, building the leadership capacity and developing high performers, I look at this in sort of two separate lanes. One is we want the individual department, say the department head, to really focus on the skills and what gaps are there in their department to make sure that they're a fully functioning sort of business unit on their own, right? And so that's where we get a lot of that information on how to build out these learning and development strategies, curriculums, however we want to deploy that to people. And then concurrently, I also see another aspect of learning and development in terms of just the employee's professional development in general, right? And so we start to think to ourselves, how do we prepare an employee for some of these soft skills that we might need them to have if they're, kind of being promoted up through a manager, right? So are we, promoting someone from, one level of the org to the next, and are we giving them the right sort of training to understand what it means to manage people? Are we giving them any kind of training on communication and communication practices? And then back to the last slide, are we training our managers on how to deliver performance feedback? And are we also providing guidance and training on how to receive that feedback from a subordinate, right? And so there are a whole bunch of different areas that we can look at with that. And so I think one of the important things we have to do here, though, is also listen to the employees when we're identifying what these development needs are. So when I built out this learning management system, I included everything that we needed for skill-specific training for that particular role or for that particular department. But on the side, we also made sure to include things like Excel building trainings. We also included things on what it means to have executive presence. We included a whole other area of trainings and courses that employees could pick from as they wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to grow as they want. And that, I think, is very important because it does a couple of things for us. One, we have the structure in place where we're being able to provide this training and this content to the employees, but we're also giving them the resources to continue to grow and develop as professionals and internally in a way that makes sense for them. And so that can be things like, cross-training or cross-functional training with other departments if they want to learn a new skill, or if someone is in finance, they might want to learn something a little bit about marketing, provide an opportunity for that to happen. But then also what it does is we're providing the space for the employees to get what they need internally with us. And it prevents, or shouldn't say prevent, but it reduces the opportunity for them to have to go outside of our organization to look for these development needs. And that helps with our retention, right? That it makes an employee want to stay with us because they're getting everything that we need from them. So if we think of it in terms of this mechanism, was as long as we continue feeding the employees with valuable content, valuable information, comprehensive performance management, total reward strategy, and compensation and benefits, if we're feeding all that to the employee, it's going to make them want to stay there. And then when you align that with our culture work, we're creating an environment where we're going to have employees who will maybe hopefully start staying again for 5 to 10 years, because we've all seen what the new trends are now, where an employee might stay with an organization for 1.5 years, 2 years at most, and then move on. And so really focusing on your learning and development can help with your retention and really developing these employees. And then when you're investing in them, you're going to get so much more out of that employee, which is really fantastic. Jill, what else do you think there?
Yeah, and I think that, again, as we're talking about all these things being so interconnected, so when we look at learning and development, and then when we go to next talking about rewards, right? One of the things we hear from our clients a great deal is we have a really flat organization. We don't have, a deep hierarchy. We have a pretty flat org. And how do we develop people? How do we develop people? How do we keep people, right? So part of this will be a conversation around compensation and rewards that we will, I think, have next. But part of it really is about the cross-training piece, developing employees, giving them growth opportunities internally without necessarily being able to promote them from a manager to a director, or a director to a VP. What are the learning opportunities? I just, one of the things that just came to mind is years ago, I was recruiting someone out of Merrill Lynch. She had just become a VP, and I was recruiting her into a publishing firm, and she wanted to know if she could bring her VP title with her. Okay, this was years ago. And it was like, what do you mean, can you bring your VP title? It was so important to her that she had become a VP. And I related to that. But the reason I bring it up is it really is less about the title. And yes, the title is important to people, but it really is about what are you going to gain? What are you going to learn? What's the employer going to provide for you? And to Conor's point, it really does impact retention. So there are small, it's surveys, and again, it's communication around those surveys, but learning what your employees need. It really is connecting back to the performance review conversation. What is it that your employees need, and what they desire, and what's realistic and what's not realistic? And there's certainly a level setting thing, piece here. So we're not suggesting that this is so employee centric as not to. I mean, you have an organization to run and other things going on. But I think what we're trying to communicate is that while it's time consuming, it doesn't necessarily have to be financially, money's out of your pockets or out of your budgets. but it's somewhat nuanced way of doing things differently, and I think you probably are gathering, we feel very passionate about HR and people, services, solutions, and how, and we know it's not easy, but how do you create that culture where some of these things fall into place because they all impact the other areas.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing that there's no non-existent L&D right now, but they do offer professional development days, which is fantastic. And I think that's something that kind of plays into our next slide. So Abby, thank you for that, about offering some of these professional development days and additional time off or time for learning and stipends. So yeah, that's great. And I think a lot of people here can probably identify with that, talking about sabbaticals after a period of time with the company. These are in support of your learning and development, even though they aren't necessarily part of a structured curriculum or learning management system. But that just kind of goes to showcase, and Abby, thank you for sharing that everything that we do here and everything that we talk about has to be approached from a diverse perspective, right? So I come from a place where I love technology. I utilize technology with everything. So I'm always very focused on, all right, well, how am I putting this system into my HRIS, or what applicant tracking system am I using, or how am I streamlining all these things? But that's only one way. And I know that I'm somewhat limited in that. So I have to make sure that I'm being diverse and then thinking about these other areas, like Abby had just mentioned here, about offering this solution, but in a different format. So thank you for that, Abby. And because you mentioned the stipend, I think that kind of leads us really nicely into our next slide here, where we talk about total rewards. Yeah, so Jill, you want me to start this one off?
Sure, you're on a roll.
Sure. So total rewards and compensation and benefits, and how this affects your organization. What are these trends in 2023? So I think the first thing that we can probably all really identify are these new pay transparency laws that we're seeing across New York State and then other states around the country, and soon most likely across the US at some point, but it's starting to expand. And so if anybody here in the audience has had any let's say stress points with that, and making sure that you're including your salary range in your job descriptions, or trying to navigate what this looks like, feel free to pop that in the chat. Let us know if you're experiencing any sort of frustration with that, because that's a lot of feedback that we've gotten from a lot of our clients, is understanding how to navigate this process and what that means for an organization. And then for nonprofits in particular, because we already identified that we have pretty significant budget restrictions, how are we attracting that top talent without necessarily being able to compensate them at a traditional for-profit organization, and how they can? We don't have the same capacity. And so something that we've really identified with that, and Jill, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is that really leaning into all these other areas that we're talking about, leaning into the culture, leaning into performance management, leaning into learning and development to provide for the employees, to increase all of those. I consider to be part of the total rewards package, right? Like when I join an organization, I want to know what professional development opportunities am I getting here? To me, that's part of my compensation. It's part of what I'm getting for my time here. And Jill, as we were discussing this earlier, you were kind of looking at it from a different perspective. I'd love to kind of hear that.
Sure. So again, while each of these different areas of people management impact the other, when we talk about, I guess, pure rewards, and rewards as in monetary rewards, or whether it's compensation or it's health benefits or retirement, there's also, time, looking at time off. And holidays, and how much vacation time people have, and that's all part of it, and what other peripheral auxiliary insurances there are that people are getting. But to take it, and so I'm looking at it from total rewards from that perspective. And I think that what's happening in such a big way, we are getting a lot of requests to do comp and benefits benchmarking, and where is that coming from? I think if we look at the last few years, where it's coming from is, how do we stay competitive? How do we attract talent? And where are our salaries and our benefits relative to other organizations? So we see an enormous need, and organizations more and more wanting to benchmark. And what does that mean? That means that then they get information, you get information, which then puts you in a situation of really having to evaluate where you want to spend your money. right? So, you're finding out that the social service organization that's, one of your, in the same space you're in, they're paying $25 an hour versus 20, or 18 versus 15. And what does that mean for you? When you look at raising your salaries after you've done some benchmarking, it's frightening because it could be very, very costly for you. And there's no solution there. What we recommend and what we see is sometimes organizations are going department by department, right? So they've just done a reorg in marketing, and marketing's been a very vulnerable area. I'll use development because it's just so clear, right? So development folks are really hard to find. They're extremely hard to find. It's incredibly competitive. You do benchmarking and you see that your development roles are way below market. And what do you do about that? And what kind of strategy? What is your overall strategy? Where do you want to be? Where do you want to sit in the 25th percentile or 50th percentile? And so the information, which is accessible, and we were talking earlier today about some free, salary surveys that you can get, or benefits surveys that you can get. And we do a lot of this work. It is really about what do you do with the information you get? And that is challenging. And what has put pressure on this more significantly, as Conor said, is the pay transparency and pay equity, pay equity and pay transparency, and equity being the driver, right? And transparency being so important. And it really is, and it really, by the way, it is supported by the communication and your transparency. So while organizations are not necessarily yet comfortable with saying, oh, we're bringing in a VP or an SVP, or a COO at a salary of $150,000, they're not comfortable saying that because of the ramifications, right, within the organization, or they need to bring in a new director of programs. There's a chain reaction there, and there is a cost involved. So we encourage you to be very transparent, talk to your employees about where you're going to focus first, because you can't do it all in terms of changing things because of the costs being so high. And I think the other piece is, I think more and more organizations, as it relates to benefits, are saying we've been really generous as nonprofits. We've been incredibly generous because that's been what we've been able to do, because we haven't been able to raise salaries. And we're hearing more and more, employers are now saying, nonprofit employers are saying, I have to change up my benefits. I have to reduce them. And what this says to us is, okay, look at all the other pieces of your people management, and how do you, yes, salary and benefits are important. Time off is important. Being able to reimburse your employees for different things, whether it's trainings, whether it's their education in the past, trying to find creative ways. But where you can't spend the money, the other creative things and the communication and the culture and the employee development, and those are critical things, because your rewards and your comp and benefits obviously are going to impact your bottom line. So again, I would say that our organizations are really looking to cut benefits. And this to me is a great example of why it's so important to do the other things that attract and retain talent.
Yeah. There's just so much that we could get into with this. And I think the compensation and benefits is really a two-way feedback mechanism with culture, right? And trying to figure out, how do you balance all these things? If you give one thing up here, how are you replacing it here? And so it's a lot of work to be done. But one thing I do want to mention before we move on, because I know we're getting a little short on time here, was that once you have your compensation philosophy in place, and you understand what these total rewards are and the total compensation and the benefits look like, it would be really important to make sure that you're including that in your job posting. People want to know, can I bring my dog to the office? Is it a relaxed culture and environment where, I might not necessarily have to wear a suit every day? These are things that employers that that candidates are looking for, employees are looking at as part of their benefits, right? Like, oh, I can go to work and I can bring my dog if I need to. So, really kind of expand what you're thinking of in terms of benefits and showcase that from the very beginning.
Yeah. Great
Yeah, it's
question here. I'm sorry, Connor.
Yeah,
Great question here that I want to get in because I think this is also important. So how many of you are doing cost of living adjustments rather than merit increases? I think because I have found during COVID, there were either no cost of living adjustments or there was some, but really not merit increases. Anyone share with us? COLA, not merit. Other folks? Your input's always helpful to your colleagues.
COLA, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
COLA. I think it's fantastic that we're seeing a lot of that response for the cost of living adjustment, right? Because the more that you don't focus on that, if you're not integrating that into your annual budget review, you're just going to start lagging the market. And when you do your compensation work in the future, it's going to be that much of a heavier lift.
And Abby, you're saying that not doing a merit is negatively impacting performance management, pay for performance. Yeah. Pay for performance is a tough strategy and concept in the nonprofit world, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. And I think there's a whole lot to talk about relative to that. And we'd love to do a session on it. Technology.
Yeah, technology.
Technology guru.
So Jill, maybe if you want to set this up, just talking about, how critical technology can be for an organization, and I can pop into some of the specifics and then leave everyone with a million questions about AI that not even I have answers to.
Right. So what we're finding with smaller orgs is that they have not possibly been able to financially make a commitment to technology, to HR technology. And I think there are a few things that come to mind. One is that with the investment in some kind of technology that's really more specific to your organization and your size and your need, without going to an large enterprise system and bringing in technology slowly, is really very critical to your organization. And I think what we also find is that you will, once you start to use technology after its implementation, which is hard, after all the kinks are out, or most of the kinks are out, its use and function and saving time is enormous. So many of the organizations we work with are using spreadsheets, for 20, 30, 40 employees. And we know that that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So while we never are suggesting how you spend your money, what we are saying is that there is real value in technology. And so, Connor, I'm going to let you speak back to you. That's such a strong knowledge around that.
Yeah, so technology, as Jill was just saying, that it's so valuable to an organization, and I think you have to make sure that when you're sourcing whatever technology you plan to use, it's appropriate for your organization. You don't want to go to these huge enterprise things like Jill was mentioning, but there are other alternatives. And so, for instance, to give you an example, in the past, I joined a nonprofit, and I was the head of HR, and this nonprofit was founded in 1863. And when I joined, they were still operating as if it was 1863. And I had gone to the executive director and put forth a case that I needed to get his buy-in to make sure that we are investing in this technology. And so we baby stepped our way up to a full human resource information system. And so we built out a bridge platform through this service called Monday.com, and we created an applicant tracking system, and then eventually got over to a much larger vendor to have a full suite of HR technologies. But I think one of the most important things to keep in mind here, and why I'm such an advocate for tech, is that it streamlines and automates so much of your process. If you can make something accessible for an employee and give them self-service options in terms of updating direct deposit or, updating an address or taking any sort of HR function. You're empowering that employee to take control of their career and take ownership of their engagement with the organization, which is going to increase your employee engagement, which is really fantastic. But one of the more exciting things about using HR technology is that it allows the HR practitioner to automate and streamline more of their administrative work to focus on the really important things on an organization, like the culture, talking about performance management, looking at your talent acquisition. It frees up that HR practitioner or executive director to be able to focus on the more important things. And then, of course, jumping into AI, AI is just something that we can all sort of probably identify with at this point, hearing about ChatGPT and what that means for the future of workforce. And while many people kind of feel that it's a little scary in terms of, maybe this is going to take my job, I think the progressive HR practitioner, the progressive business owner and leader is going to start realizing, how do we utilize this to help better support the human beings that are here right now, to free them up to focus on other things. But HR tech is a big topic. We don't have much time left, but something that's very valuable. We wanted to make sure that we highlighted for everybody. And Jill, unless you have anything else, I think maybe we jump into some Q&A.
Yeah, and yes, Abby, sorry, Allison just let us know that we are needing to move along. There's so much here, and we know we kind of went quickly and wanted to kind of really, I think the takeaways are around this really being a ongoing process, impacted by what your particular immediate needs are, but all interrelated in such a tremendous way. And each of them can be discussed and delved into and analyzed. And, we'd be pleased to do that with you. But I think that hopefully the takeaway is that there are sometimes things where you need to slow down and think about creative ways of doing things differently, to attract and retain your talent, related to culture, related to rewards, related to how you develop them. Questions for us? Any questions for us?
I do not see any questions in the chat right now. I would like to encourage everyone that's on the webinar to please reach out directly to Jill if you do have any questions, to Conor if you have any questions. I know that there was quite a bit of ground covered, and I'm sure that we really just touched the tip of each iceberg, and I am so appreciative of you both being here. And I'm sure that you would be happy to answer any questions outside of this webinar at any time. So please do keep their information. Jill and Conor, if you want to put your direct email in the message in the chat before we close it up, you may want to do that so people can. Oh, there you go. It's right there on the slide. I want to thank you both so much for your time, for your knowledge. It seems to be like an ever-changing universe. Yeah. And we really appreciate you keeping on top of it. And I know that the next webinar we do, it'll probably be something completely different. So thank you very, very much, both of you. I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. If you do have any questions, you are always welcome to reach out to any of us. We will be sure to connect you with Conor and Jill in the future. And please, if you have any questions about the Nonprofit Resource Hub, you're always welcome to reach out to me. Thank you both again, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you
all.
Thank you.